Working? Yeah. Well, welcome everyone. Real pleasure to have you join us in this session on transboundary climate risk for Southeast Asia. We've had the distinct privilege of hosting this session, BCG and Adaptation Without Borders, and together with the Stockholm Environment Institute and other partners. We're using this opportunity to launch a piece of work to lay out the case for transboundary risk management in Southeast Asia. And we'll be followed by a great panel discussion with Kathy Harris and Karina Chan, whom I'll introduce shortly. Now, to kick us off, this report is public, it's been released, but we thought it would be helpful to just do a quick drive-by summary ahead of the discussion, just 10 minutes to give you an overview of this topic, why it's important for Southeast Asia, and why this, beyond Southeast Asia is something that should be managed actively by all parties involved. So with that, I'll dive into a quick presentation. You find this online, so this is going to be a quick summary. So this is a shared perspective with between BCG and Adaptation Without Borders. It's been a great collaboration. Thank you for all the partnership in doing this. It's a big topic for Southeast Asia. As BCG, we've been deeply involved in the adaptation agenda for a number of years, and this is an area that is certainly underrepresented. Now, why is this a problem? Adaptation in general tends to focus on the national issues. So you have national adaptation plans, you have locally led adaptation, you have financing that is primarily channeled towards national and subnational priorities. So very often we're seeing this issue of transboundary climate risk fall between the cracks. And increasingly, we're seeing the effects of how supply chains, water, food, can be impacted and have cascading effects across borders. And this can be quite material. Some estimates point to transboundary risk being 10x that of national risk because of how interconnected we are as a world today. And when you look at national adaptation plans, which bring together the agenda on adaptation for a country, very few have addressed this issue of transboundary climate risk. In fact, we've done a scan and found two countries that have referenced this issue in their national adaptation plans. Now that said, there are regional organizations, the EU, the African Union, ASEAN to some extent, recognizing that this is an issue, but still a ways to go in terms of how you manage it and how you reduce that risk over time. So when we talk about transboundary risk, what are we talking about? There's the biophysical connections, and Kathy will talk about this, in much greater depth. That's water, natural systems. There's trade links, how interconnected we are with supply chains, financial flows. So where one makes decisions on FDI and investment driven by climate risk exposure, and forced migration and human mobility that is going to be exacerbated with climate impacts. I'm going to share a bit on some of these effects that are projected for Southeast Asia, and you see four here on this page. You see the interconnected nature of water, the Mekong Delta as one example where water security cuts across 4 or 5 countries. You see trade impact, so an example recently in Thailand where flooding caused a disruption in the auto supply chain that impacted multiple countries from Japan to Indonesia and so on. So multiple cascading impacts. We see the impacts on shared natural resources. So for example, the fish stock in the South China Sea, where increasing temperature is projected to force migration of the fish stock and really impact the food security of 4 or 5 countries in Southeast Asia. And then there's finance and financial flows, where impacts in one country not only have financial impacts across borders, but also when you look ahead, it impacts the decisions on where private sector across borders would invest in FDI. So that's one example. I'm going to go a bit deeper on one issue, and that's on climate migration, which is by many accounts a understood and understudied area of climate risk. Now, this is some work that BCG has done together with Cambridge University on assessing the impacts on climate migration related to water in particular. You see here some historic numbers on internal migration. It gets quite pronounced and quite worrying if you start looking ahead. These are some numbers on migration, projected migration, in a worst case scenario looking out the next 5-10 years. In Southeast Asia, there's a projection of, in the worst case scenario, we could have something like 800,000 people displaced, and this is across borders. So it's a material issue that can cause multiple stresses in both the regional economies, but also in the fabric of society. So what do we do? How do we manage this? What could a roadmap for transboundary climate risk look like? And again, we'll ask Kathy to elaborate on this, from the examples in other areas. But the African Union has started to address this with a way of understanding the risks, getting organized around platforms to address it and mobilize resources around this. So we'll get into this in our fireside chat shortly. And what does it then mean for Southeast Asia? A couple of things to take away from practices and examples from other places. One is use the institutional mechanisms that are available to accelerate the action to address these issues. So ASEAN as a platform is one example. Understanding the impacts, just creating transparency on what does it mean for the countries in the region, for bilateral areas of interest, just putting some visibility and numbers to what it means to trade, to investment, to people, and really bringing in the scientific community and policymakers to elevate the issues and make it clearer in terms of the implications of what you could do about it. And finally, there are regional cross-border issues, but you want to engage civil society and local organizations to address some of these impacts. So some lessons to be learned, and certainly this is only a subset of things that one could do. So to wrap up this summary, what could Southeast Asia do? Well, first, build a comprehensive collective understanding of what these transboundary climate risks are. Second, start to enhance and develop a framework, and it could be around ASEAN, it could be other mechanisms as well, to bring the parties together to understand and also start to shape collective action priorities. And finally, all this has to hit the ground, so getting into specific projects and programs that hit these cross-border issues, whether it's on food and water security, or whether that's in trade and supply chains, moving that agenda forward. So that's a quick drive-by. I encourage you to download the report and look into it. It's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists for a fireside chat on this issue. We have Kathy Harris, who's been a great collaborator on this piece from Adaptation Without Borders, who's also part of a senior research fellow in the Stockholm Environment Institute. Karina Chan, who's the CEO of the Singapore International Foundation, and also a catalyst in setting up a platform for addressing some of these cross-border issues in ASEAN in water. So with that, welcome. I will put this on so that I can hear as well. So first question, maybe Kathy, starting with you. You've looked at this issue for many years. What are some of the learnings that you've gathered that if I put it this way, we know it's an issue. What are the ingredients to start getting some action mobilized around this?
Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today in a very noisy COP, talking about transboundary climate risks. We've really seen rising awareness of these risks in the last few years, driven, if I can humbly say, but by the efforts of the Adaptation Without Borders Partnership. We are a growing global partnership. We're led by a consortium of 3 organisations, so the Stockholm Environment Institute, ODI and IDRI, but we're at 10 organisations from around the world who collectively have been working to really strengthen international cooperation on adaptation to manage transboundary and cascading climate risks. And this is really a topic that's gone from relative obscurity a few years ago. We came together in 2019, literally around a round table at a COP in Bonn, or maybe it was 2018. I'll probably get corrected on that in a minute. And we really felt that the discussions on adaptation planning were really being driven by a very limited or narrow understanding of climate risk. That when countries were commissioning their climate risk assessments and drafting their adaptation plans, that they were really looking only at the impacts of climate change from within their borders. But actually, we are all connected. So if we think about how a country might be exposed or vulnerable to climate change impacts, we also need to account for that country's dependencies, their connections, their vulnerabilities as they relate to other countries around the world. So last year at the COP, we saw the first decision text, I would say, on transboundary climate risk, and I can talk more about that in a moment. But there is still a huge gulf, I would say, between ambition to act on these issues and actual action to adapt to these risks. And happy to talk more about this, but not to take up too much time now. We see in Adaptation Without Borders that there are 3 pillars of work that is needed. So first of all, we need much greater understanding of these risks. We need tools to identify, assess, measure, track these risks that are complex and uncertain and difficult to quantify. We need engagement with policymakers around the world, not only those that are often the ones driving and delivering national adaptation plans in countries, but trade ministries, foreign ministries, finance ministries, all the different ministries that these risks affect, that they really affect the capabilities and the mandates of these different ministries. And we need to drive cooperation right from the local level. We hear a lot about locally led adaptation, and that is important, but we need adaptation and we need cooperation across scales. So we need cooperation happening bilaterally between countries, regionally, being driven by the regional organizations, and also internationally as well. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Kathy. We'd love to dive into a bit deeper, with some examples as we get into the discussion. Karina, you've had a long experience in driving impact programs, across the region. You've now set up this platform for water, and water is a big issue in Southeast Asia. Too much and too little. It's we're seeing it increasing every day. What would you say are some of the things that you're hoping to achieve with the platform, and where do you see the cross-border nature of issues being addressed with this?
Thank you, Dave. So, in Southeast Asia, we wanted ground-up initiative as well. So more so than top-down, since transboundary risk related to climate need buy-in of local community. So we started this initiative, a platform called the Southeast Asia Partnership for Adaptation Through Water. This is a partnership with the World Economic Forum. So we initiated the talks and we started talking about it in February. The initiative was launched in June, and very fast, Katie, you were talking about action. So very fast, we have already put together our first project. It was announced like yesterday. The first project in Sarawak in Malaysia, helping to deliver clean water. And that's because the source of water has been affected by climate. And this is really bringing multi-sector stakeholders. So CPAW is the acronym for Southeast Asia Partnership for Adaptation Through Water. We aim to bring together people with the knowledge, so like BCG is a member, people who have got the solutions, people who have got the financing capabilities to look at projects in Southeast Asia. So that is the start. And more often we look at water as it's an interconnected issue, as you know. And the reason why we would like to focus on adaptation is because so much attention has been on mitigation. Adaptation, we need to really look at it because it's about resilience. And 90% of adaptation relates to water. And hence, that platform is set up to do that.
Thanks so much, Karina, and congratulations on the first project. It's fantastic to see in such a short period of time that a platform is starting to catalyze action on the ground. We certainly need much more of that, across the region. Kathy, if you're okay to go a little bit deeper on what you've seen as what works, maybe with some examples. You mentioned the need for understanding the application of tools. You mentioned using institutional mechanisms, and I guess in some instances you have mechanisms that exist and you can use those, and in some areas maybe you need to create new ones, right, for it to work. And there's also this question of in understanding these risks, there's so much that is it's a blind space, right?
Yeah.
Because I just reflect a bit on that Thailand example, and that's closer to home. Who would have thought 3 countries would have that level of impact? And there was an insurance write-off of something like 15 billion. I don't think anyone understood that was going to be the case, right? So maybe just get a little bit of reflections on how do you start to really unpack this understanding piece to a further level.
Yeah, great question. Actually, King's College recently this year released a study suggesting that climate change impacts on global supply chains could reach 25 trillion in net losses by 2060. I mean, these are huge numbers, and we've really only just begun to scratch the surface when it comes to understanding how our economies and our societies are at risk as a result of climate change. And really, governments, I would argue, really have to rethink reimagine what they mean by adaptation. Yes, adaptation should be locally led. Yes, adaptation should be context specific and culturally appropriate, and it has to work for people, for the people for whom these risks actually manifest. But we can't always push action down and the responsibilities down to the local level. We're absolving governments, regional organisations, international organisations from the responsibilities that they have to adapt to climate change. But also we're missing harnessing the opportunities that they could play in driving the adaptation agenda. And this is only going to get more critical, right, as the world continues to warm. So in terms of good practices, I can sort of give a few examples. So at the national level, we have seen some countries really take proactive steps to try and integrate transboundary climate risks into their climate risk and vulnerability assessments and into their national adaptation plans. They're learning by doing. And I think there is no blueprint for how to do this yet. There's no well sort of regarded or very robust or well accepted way at the moment to integrate these risks into risk assessments, but some countries are at the vanguard. They're doing it, and there's much more that we could learn from those efforts, and I think they're willing to share. The risk is there, though, that it's the countries that have the resources and the capacities to do so. So a number of countries, for instance, we're seeing across Europe, the UK, for example, is a real front runner in this. They've identified a number of transboundary climate risks that they're exposed and vulnerable to in their latest risk assessment. They've really integrated them into their third national adaptation plan, and they've even assigned risk owners. They've assigned every single risk an owner within government, and that risk owner's mandate is to work across the government, across different ministries, to look at how the government responds to those risks. So that's an example of good practice. We need many more of these, but we also need to encourage knowledge sharing and much more cooperation on how we do that between countries. Then just maybe one more example at the regional level. We've seen an increasing number of regional adaptation plans and strategies. You mentioned some of those in your presentation, that are starting to sort of recognize that their member states are vulnerable to these risks, and perhaps as a regional bloc they can do something to work together, to cooperate, and to collectively build resilience to these risks. So just to give 3 examples, ASEAN State of Climate Change report from 2021. I mean, that's a report, but it was really one of the first, along with the European Union adaptation strategy from that year, that really recognised the transboundary nature of climate risk. And then we've seen in 2022 the release of the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy, runs for the next 10 years. We've seen some really very proactive efforts by African ministries, also by the African Union Development Agency, and by the African group of negotiators here at the COP to really raise the sorts of transboundary climate risks that African member states face. And they often face like what we call like double exposure. So they're very affected by the direct impacts of climate change. They are also very affected by the transboundary impacts of climate change. And on top of that, they've got some of the least resources to cope. So it's essential, but there are some really encouraging signs and some best practices starting to emerge.
Great, thanks, Kathy. It's great to hear about the positive signs and almost like organic response that, you know, we have this issue, we need to deal with it. I'd love to pick up with you later on this issue of risk ownership, because, you know, if something is spread across multiple boundaries and, you know, it's a collective problem, but who owns it, you know, is something that perhaps, you know, is not always clear. So we'd love to pick that up with you in a bit. Karina, taking a Southeast Asia lens, and you know, you've seen it from, you know, multiple vantage points and so on. I guess 2 questions. One is, you know, given the nature of Southeast Asia, highly diverse, you know, there's you know, very different, you know, starting circumstances for each country, but also highly interdependent and interconnected. You know, what would be some of the areas of priority that you think would be important for Southeast Asia, you know, on the transboundary end, and secondly, you know, given, you know, the ASEAN platforms and, you know, what you've seen and the platforms that you've created, you know, are there some lessons and learnings on how do you catalyze collaboration in the region that you think are worth, you know, raising to the fore?
So I think while institutional platforms are useful, sometimes we need to be a bit nimble and we need to move fast. I think that was the genesis of why we thought a platform such as CPOR would be able to work with multi-sector stakeholders and move a bit faster. And we want to focus on projects. So we just go beyond talking, which, you know, you hear at many platforms. People talk, people share. People say that this is good to do, we need to do that. But after that, it stops. And then you'll be wondering, like, what next? So when we created the platform, I think we were very focused that projects, actions, and collaborations very important. Multi-sector stakeholders. And we want to work with the government. Because we work on projects and we can only do pilots. Because I think no amount of funding will be able to scale projects and make that kind of impact in a certain country that we want to implement our projects. So working with the government is important, but we get the rest of the house in order first, which is working on with people to curate the projects. So water is one. What we are doing now, we are working with stakeholders on agriculture, rice planting. So in Southeast Asia, rice, huge producer, huge consumer. And when we talk about adaptation, it really affects the smallholder farmers, the rural communities. When we talk about piloting means that the different geography, different soil conditions, different weather actually it impacts how you grow rice. So we are now working with a solution provider who is a member of CPAW. The solution works to reduce water, reduce fertilizer input. It's very precision using drip irrigation and fertigation to grow rice that can increase the yield for smallholder farmers, reduce methane, and in the longer term, there'll be carbon credits to be yielded. So we want the smallholder farmers who actually make up 80 to 90% of, agriculture production to transition to a sustainable way of growing rice. But to do that, we also will need to give them some motivation. So things like, being able to offtake the rice produced is important. So there is an example of how we approach projects and under CPAW, looking at pilots and looking to scale. And it's important to get the private sector in. And yesterday we had a session, we talked about, to get the private sector in, transparency, data, all these are hygiene factors before they would come in. So while working on projects, we are at the same time working with foundations and private sector and the government to look at financing for these projects to be able to scale. So I think Southeast Asia is very complex. I mean, look at ASEAN, 10 countries. Each country has got its own liking for rice. So it's not like one variety of rice works for all 10 countries, no. Yeah, so we need to also localize and contextualize what we are bringing to a community. Buy-in from communities is very important because we can put in the policies, bring in the help. Government regulations can set something up, but if the communities don't buy into what you're trying to do, it's wasted. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Karina, I think just wanted to pick up on this example you gave because I think this is a really fantastic example of how also a solution, an adaptation solution to a transboundary climate risk doesn't have to be transboundary. It can happen at the local level. So let me give you an example. So Southeast Asia produces a lot of the rice that the rest of the world eats. Of course, it's also very much eaten and traded within the region, but it's also traded internationally. And it's a problem. It's a problem for the world. It's a problem for the world, not just Southeast Asia, but if climate change threatens the yields of that rice. And if we can then adapt to support small-scale farmers to adapt to climate change, the effects of climate change that are happening in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, also in South Asia, in India and so on, then we need to capture that in terms of the resilience building, not only that does locally, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of adapted water supplies and so on, and water accessibility, but also internationally, because if that's then strengthening the food security of countries all around the world that rely on rice to eat, that rely on the rice as an import. And this is where our adaptation investments, if we're smart, could really pay double dividends. They can be, with the same investment, strengthening the adaptation of rice, small-scale rice producers and farmers in Southeast Asia, and the food security of countries all around the world that are dependent on that rice that is grown for their food security. And we did a case study on this, for example, looking at Senegal and what happens if imports of rice for a staple crop, staple food commodity such as rice, is curtailed because of climate change impacts, and the effects this can have in terms of sort of tripling prices and local markets that can then lead to riots in the street and so on. So this makes financial sense, but we've got to get better at capturing and quantifying that investment in terms of adaptation and resilience building.
So just to elaborate a bit more about that, right? When we talk about scaling, so one part of scaling is you do pilot in country. If it's successful, it scales with funding from either the MDBs or the government. But the other part of scaling, which is kind of related to what you have said, is also scaling the approach. because once this is proven successful in terms of even how you work with the farming community, that approach, that methodology, whatever you learn from there can be scaled to the region and other countries. So that is what we hope to do. I mean, we are very new. The initiative was only launched in June. First project announced. Now we are working on a second project, and we've got partners, members, about 20 of them from multi-sector, trying to work on something. So for rice, for example, we know that drip irrigation is actually the most effective when you talk about reducing water. But drip irrigation is not cheap, it's expensive. So part of what the partnership does is also with the solution providers, try to innovate and look for solutions that are cost effective for implementation. Yeah.
It's truly a fantastic example on food security. What you're doing in one country has such knock-on effects, cross-border, and that Senegal example, really brings it to life, right? If what happens in Southeast Asia impacts rice prices in Senegal by 3x. I mean, this is a global problem, right? So I mean, it's a really great example. I know we're also running short of time, but this is a fantastic discussion. With each topic we get into, would love to just keep going deeper, right? It's fantastic. And Kathy, if you're okay, to kind of unpack that a bit further. This idea of one understanding these risks. I mean, you did a case study for the rice supply chain, and you shed light on the issue. First question is, if you had the opportunity to set the agenda on, which areas of cross-border risk that you would really prioritize and look into, right? Which would those be, given the many that you've seen over the years? And the second is coming back to the earlier point on risk ownership, given that it is multi-stakeholder problem, and certainly actions at a local level would have impact, but beyond that there must be more that needs to be done, right? So the issues will fall between the cracks. Where are you starting to see appropriate coverage, ownership, accountability on these cross-border issues that allow them to be managed, right, in the appropriate way? So two questions, whichever you prefer.
Big questions. I'm going to be a typical academic and dive your first question, but only to say that I think it's really difficult to prioritize the risks at the moment. Where should you start? Transboundary climate risks cross not only countries and continents, they cross sectors. We've talked about so many different types of risks today, from movements of people to, and it's not actually the movements of people that are risks themselves, but if those flows are poorly managed, but to risks that can accrue from changes in remittances, to diminishing returns on foreign direct investments, to trade and supply chains and so on. It is very difficult for governments at the moment to know how to prioritize. Like, where do they start? And it will look different from country to country, depending on how their economy is structured, how their society is structured, and so on. We do know that certainly the more sort of open economies, those that are sort of really globally integrated and connected, will of course be more exposed. It stands to reason, the more dependencies and links you have on others, the more exposed you might be. But realistically, every country in the world is globally connected now. So what this really calls for is the development of tools, methodologies, assessment frameworks, so we can begin to assess, well, first of all, identify these risks, then begin to assess how likely they are, their magnitude in different places, and then begin to track them over time. How are these risks changing as our climate warms, but also how they interact with other non-climate drivers to sort of compound the risk or sort of amplify it even more. And we need more, and I would say this again coming from a think tank, but we need more case studies. We need to understand how these risks are already manifesting and materializing in different places, We need to know how they're affecting different groups to different degrees, so those who are most vulnerable in our societies. And we need to look across different geographies to understand how they are materializing in different places. And we released the Global Transboundary Climate Risk Report a couple of years ago that did start to explore these issues, but we feel as a partnership there is a need to do much more, but to really do research that equips decision makers and policy makers with the information they need to make those decisions, to be able to prioritize, to know where they should look to first, where they should really focus. So that's what I would call for there. On risk ownership, remind me of your question.
These issues are cascading across border.
Yeah.
So it's everyone's problem, but who owns it? So how do you unpack that and how do you manage this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's, we call for much greater dialogue to try and unpack and dissect this. I mean, you take the example of transboundary climate risks to trade and supply chains. What role should the private sector be playing versus what role should the public sector be playing is complex, and it's impossible to sort of create a general understanding. It depends on the supply chain or the value chain or those involved. So it really requires much stronger cooperation, very practically, between the private sector and between governments to look into what each side can do and to really unpack some of the myths and assumptions going on here. Because often a lot of the governments, civil servants, policymakers we talk to really think that the private sector have got this all in hand. Like the private sector, used to managing risk across their supply chains. But the private sector companies we're talking to are saying, actually, we need a much stronger enabling environment from governments to do this. These risks are of a level of magnitude greater than perhaps the sorts of risks we've faced before. And our traditional tactics and strategies, such as diversification or substitution of products that we're used to helping us manage risk and hedge risk and so on, will be less effective when climate change is happening all around the world and creating a much riskier world overall. So we need much greater dialogue to really unpack in specific cases who does own these risks and who can and should play a role in managing them.
Thanks, Kathy. And complex problems will never have a silver bullet for it, right? So you need to create the tools and create the transparency, the capacity, and maybe unpack it, an area at a time, or a bilateral agreement at a time, and just expanding from there, right? So this is to make it practical and actionable. I would love to open up to the audience for any questions or reflections you have. But before that, maybe a final question, Karina. A bit more on what's next for CPO. You're having the projects that are coming to life. You're impacting immediate adaptation issues that have cross-border impact in the region and frankly beyond as well. How do you see the priorities for CPO looking ahead, and any other reflections for ASEAN on this issue?
Before I go into that, I think I just want to share a thought on risk, right? I think more often than not, the risk for many stakeholders is the uncertain environment, the uncertainty. I mean, it could range anything from policies to regulations, and the risk of looking short-term and not looking long-term. I mean, when you talk about projects, when you talk about adaptation efforts, it's a long journey. But, many people, especially in a politically sensitive environment, I mean, the short-term need to show something, to use something, actually is a risk itself, because then it limits your longer-term effort, because you're just focusing on the next thing that's going to happen, maybe the next election and all that. But the longer-term focus needs to be there. I mean, the next thing for CPOL is it will be just very focused on a project. So projects implementation is definitely one part of it. We are also working very closely with the GCEW, the Global Commission for the Economics of Water, the report has come out, the recommendations are there. Many of it relate to water. So insofar as we are working very closely with GCW in terms of implementing some of the policy recommendations in the region. So that is another key item that we are going to work on for CPOR.
Fantastic, Karina. And the water issue is now, with the Global Commission, it's just raised how transboundary it is, much greater than what we, the general public had visibility on, right? With the cross-regional flows of moisture and so on. So it's really fantastic. I highly recommend everyone to read that report. We have a few minutes. We'd love to open up for any reflections or questions that, Richard.
Yeah, thanks very much. I wanted to pick up on a point that Kathy made earlier in the decision text of last year where parties called for international cooperation. In your view, when it comes to transboundary climate risk, what would be the nature of that international cooperation that is needed?
Great question. Collaboration, cooperation can take many different forms. I think clearly there's an opportunity for cooperation on the technical level, to really pool resources and share information, both to pool resources to develop some of the tools and frameworks that I've been talking about, but also on the technical level to share information about the risks that each country is facing, but also how they're planning to adapt to those risks. And one of the things we've not talked about much today, but which certainly ODI take a very strong lead on, is that the effects of adaptation actions can also have transboundary consequences. We tend to think of adaptation as being inherently benevolent, but it can also create winners and losers, and what might enhance the resilience of one group in one country might undermine the resilience of another. So it's really important that on a technical level, we're sharing information about the risks, but we're also sharing information about how we adapt to them. But it also needs to happen on the political level, and I believe we need much stronger bilateral cooperation between countries on adaptation. Adaptation should be a top priority for countries as they think about their international relations, as they conduct their foreign policy. Right now, everybody's focused on mitigation, but adaptation needs to really be elevated to become a political priority as well. So we're going to need bilateral cooperation between countries to manage risks, particularly where those risks sort of flow between them. We need regional cooperation, and we've been working particularly SEI and ODI, but with the African Union Commission, with the African regional economic communities, with the member states, to look at how we can encourage and strengthen regional cooperation to manage these risks, and have got various decisions coming out of that from AMCEN and other places, and a roadmap that we've actually developed to say, what does this cooperation look like in practice that you mentioned earlier. And then we need more of the international cooperation. Transboundary climate risks should be, such a stronger feature of the discussions here at the COP than it is. And we got that decision text that I mentioned before in the global stocktake, in the global goal on adaptation, where parties for the first time recognised the transboundary nature of climate risk, called for more international cooperation and knowledge sharing to come up with adaptation solutions. But just because we've got that text in there once doesn't mean it's there to stay, right? And some of these risks are political, but we risk countries, taking a very protectionist approach, putting up walls, trying to defend themselves by closing themselves off from the world, and that is actually the most risky thing that they can do. Globalization is here to stay. These risks are here to stay. We need cooperation if we're going to manage these risks effectively, and that should echo at all levels, from the local scale to the global scale, in terms of these sorts of forums and discussions.
Great point. One more question, one reflection on this. I can't imagine anyone is better off by walling off your city, right? It's just, can't imagine that's a good outcome.
Thank you. It's great to see the private sector here today on the stage, represented by Boston Consulting Group. The question is, I guess, why is Boston Consulting Group interested in this agenda? I mean, it's a very it's a large management consultancy. It has, I think something like, is it 12.3 billion annual revenue, something like that. So why is Boston Consulting sort of interested in it? Is it because the private sector is seeing that this is an agenda that needs investment and that needs financing? Kind of just to get your take from that perspective.
No, thanks for the question. There's probably a few answers to that from a Boston Consulting Group standpoint. So the first is that we've been involved in this adaptation agenda for a number of years. It started off with our social impact practice, right? So, as a firm, we have a dedicated social impact practice that is intended to contribute to development impact, outcomes that are good for communities and so on. So it started off there before it started to hit the private sector. This many years. Increasingly, this is becoming something that is a high priority for corporate clients, because they are faced with impacts on their supply chains, they are faced with impacts on their manufacturing facilities, the health of their workforces, right? These are all issues that they'll need to deal with, and like countries and regional economic blocs, companies and sectors are not very well equipped to deal with this issue because, one, they don't understand it, they don't understand the range of impacts and the cascading impacts, and they are just getting to the point of how do you invest to adapt. Right? This is something that is just coming up. So coming back to BCG, our involvement started off from a social impact standpoint and has grown into something that is intersecting both the public and private, and our professional practice.
Right. Yep. Thanks very much for the interesting panel. So I have a question today, actually more about disaster risk management. So I think today, I understand the topic of this is actually climate resilience as a whole, and today I think a lot of the discussion has centered around longer term adaptation planning. But I was wondering, where do you see room for more international and regional cooperation, let's say after disaster has struck and you need to respond to it? Yeah.
Great question. I'm going to open it up for Kathy and Karina if you'd like to take that one.
So disaster response, it's something that I think many international NGOs are in this space. But I think rather than looking at response, we look at how we prevent it in the first place. So I think one pillar of CPAW is looking at asset protection, and that's where we will work with our stakeholders, our members, to put in that resilience. So even for financial institutions, I mean, you're talking about insurers, for example, and more so they look at resilience insurance rather than trying to recover the loss when a disaster strikes.
Thanks. Yeah, we definitely look at disasters too. I mean, transboundary climate risks are generated through both slow onset warming and changes and slower changes to crop yields, for instance, but they're also, of course, spurred by extreme events, including disasters. And I actually think the disaster, like the DRM community, the disaster risk management community, has got a lot to teach the climate community more broadly. You look at the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, it's really strong on the transboundary nature of climate risk. And the global assessment reports that have come out in recent years have also been really strong in calling for much greater cooperation between countries to manage the cascading effects of disasters. I mean, the ASEAN State of Climate Change report, as I mentioned before, places the assessment and adaptation to transboundary climate risks as one of the sort of priority areas for adaptation by 2030. But there are a number of other, especially across ASEAN, number of other relevant documents. So the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, for instance, the work programme running to 2025, acknowledges transboundary climate risk and calls for transboundary risk assessment. So in short, I think the community has a lot to teach the wider community. I think the policies are often there in place. It's there in the right wording is there. But where we've got to get much stronger is putting this into practice. And this is, transboundary climate risks, whether from disasters or otherwise, are an inherently political topic. That alone accounts for not also because they're very complex, but that alone accounts for perhaps why we're not seeing as much cooperation on adaptation as there could be. But I think we really call on countries to overcome this, to look at what they have in common, their shared and common risks, but also the benefits that can be gleaned from them working in cooperation as opposed to in silos. That's also a role where we here at the COP can play in again starting to qualify and quantify what that looks like for governments. What's the cost-benefit analysis of working in cooperation versus working independently to manage these sorts of risks? So I think there's a lot more we could do in practice, but also much we can learn.
Thank you both. Any more reflections or questions from the floor? Great. I think we're right on time then. It's fantastic. It's been a great discussion. I'm going to ask you for a final word, on cross-border, something for all of us to take away. Karina and Kathy?
I think this week and for many of the convenings, we have heard a lot about the need for collaboration, the need to work together. But I think we need to move beyond the talk, and that's why I think we need to focus on action. And when we talk about collaboration, it's also in the true sense of collaboration. It's not collaboration on your own terms, and that's where I think we need to work towards.
Thanks. I'm going to echo Karina to say that, I think what this discussion has shown is that we've really done a lot to raise awareness of these risks, but we can't wait until we understand, everything about each of a transboundary climate risk or each type of transboundary climate risk before we start to think about what are the solutions to managing them. And these risks are already manifesting around the world. So we as a partnership are really focused now on trying to understand what are the solutions, what are the new partnerships we need to catalyze, what changes do we need to see, and to be bold and visionary in thinking about what does adaptation look like to these risks, and calling and holding to account adaptation funders who should be doing much more to fund cooperation to these sorts of risks. But those, again, right from the grassroots up to the global, who can design programs to build resilience to them. So I would end this with a call to action, which is that we need to start moving from ambition to action on transboundary climate risk and strengthening cooperation at all levels to manage these risks.
Great. Well, thank you both. It's been a great discussion, and I hope this has raised the issue amongst a broader set of constituents and people that can get involved and start driving action, collaboration, give and take, so that we get to better outcomes for us collectively. So thank you so much. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.